I loved the all-out racing machines that Nat Herreshoff would design. If you look at modern race boats, I think they're incredible because there's no compromise. And Nat Herreshoff designed these beautiful one design race boats that, again, at their time, were the no compromise race boats. The flush deck, clean aesthetic, and so powerful. Those Herreshoff designs are timeless, and Marilee's one of them. Their sail area to displacement ratio is through the roof. They were absolute monsters to handle on a race course.
Coming up with a plan for Marilee was working within an owner's schedule that did not want to lose a sailing season. This project, which initially came to our shop, we were supposed to do the planning for a successive year where we would do the major restoration and do a lot of engineering and design work of what was needed on the boat.
In that first winter of 2014-15, up in Belfast at French Webb, we went in with rather modest goals, but quickly we decided that there were areas of structure that needed some attention, especially with the goals for racing that we had in mind. And this was sort of the major factor. The boat wasn't going to just be gently cruised around New England in the summertime for years to come, only being in the water a few months a year. The ambitions of the program were to take it internationally, race in the Mediterranean, race in the Caribbean. And with that in mind, we decided that the structure of this boat needed to be completely sound. And there couldn't be anything that we didn't have faith in if we were going to race the boat hard.
One of the first things to do on the boat was to actually find out what we had. So MIT, Kurt Hasselbach, the curator at MIT, a fantastic resource for our industry, has been a steadfast champion of the builders restoring these classics over the years, and has opened up the Hart Nautical Museum collection, which is all the plans that came from the Herreshoff Company.
The Hart Nautical collection of the MIT Museum is one of the oldest marine collections in the United States. It was formed by MIT's Department of Naval Architecture and Marine Engineering in 1922. The Hart collections are largely archival, and they contain approximately 400,000 items, mostly photographic. There's a large collection of models, marine art, and a very, very large collection of plans. The Herreshoff Manufacturing Company design records is one of the larger plan collections in that group. About 14,000 plans, about 19,000 object records altogether. The Herreshoff design record is very heavily used by the classic boat community. It's used by model builders, it's used by people studying design. Because of that heavy use, we have started a project to digitize the entire collection and put this collection online. We are digitizing the plan collections in our studio. Evelyn Ansel is our primary digitization specialist doing that part of this huge project.
There's something about the manufacturing company's history and its pedigree and its legacy and the quality of build and the attention to detail all the way down to the molding and the way the planks are fastened. There's so many components to these boats that are worth replicating. As a result, we have all this information about how they were built. We have all the drawings, we have the interiors, we have the offsets, we have all these historic photographs. We have examples of the boats themselves in unrestored condition, which means that we can look at the methods the manufacturing company actually used to put them together.
Todd French and his team at French Webb, they are extremely appreciative to have that level of certainty in the construction plans, and they have to then make decisions on their course of work based on what the owner's needs are and based on what the original design is. And I think that this refit program for Marilee adhered very, very closely to the integrity of the design while still understanding the owner's needs, which is to race this boat really hard. The New York 40s were called the Fighting 40s because they raced very, very hard. And that is Tim Rudder's intention with Marilee, to bring out the best in that boat.
It was recommended to us by Paul Buttrose, who had been involved in the restorations of Dorade, sunny, stormy weather. He recommended that we get a three-dimensional hull scan of the boat to see where we were.
It was fascinating to watch. This machine went around and took a gazillion points in our shop. And then the engineer was able to massage these digital files and come up with the shape of Marilee, what it was in 2015. I was able to entice Ed McClave to come into the project. And Ed is just this iconic Herreshoff engineer designer. He has dedicated his life to the Herreshoff legacy, but what it means from a structural engineering performance standpoint.
Ed McClave prepared CAD drawings of the original 1926 drawings provided by Kurt Hasselbeck at MIT's Hart Nautical collection. We scanned the boat three-dimensionally and then converted that into CAD and laid the two drawings on top of each other to find out where we were. She was hogged 2 inches in the transom, she was 2 inches high at the chain plates, and actually asymmetric fore and aft. Once we knew that, we knew we needed a strong boat that was sound structurally, but we also knew that there was a lot of work ahead to get the boat to be the perfect New York 40 that the owner obviously wanted. So that first season was difficult because by the time we found out how much work had to be done, it was middle of January, closing in on February. And racing in that 2015 season was never in doubt. We were going to go racing. We refastened the entire hull. We removed a few fasteners and found that they were not exactly sound. So we decided to create custom designed fasteners, 3,000 of them, and we refastened the entire hull.
This is where no expense was spared on the materials. Custom screws were made for the boat, to the right pitch, to the right thread length, so that everything was working in concert as it should have been.
We replaced a portion of the keel back aft. We replaced probably 80% of the floor frames. We also replaced about 45% of the starboard side planking, both single and double planks, and about 60% of the port side planking. Those were some of the major pieces that we tackled in that first season, not to mention a few others, such as moving the placement of the engine from really far aft, where it was unsupported, into the center of the boat. It was better for racing and also for the structure of the boat. These boats were incredibly lightly built. They weren't meant to last 95 years, and they didn't have as much structure in the ends as a modern boat does. So having all that weight back aft actually was probably the reason why we had that hog that we found, 2 inches in the transom.
Getting weight out of the ends of the boat is like paramount. And so we were able to find some plans of the New York 40s that had engines closer to centerline. And we were able to actually move this power plant a good 12 14 feet forward from where it was.
In the first season of restoration, we had a lot to bite off. Incredibly, we accomplished the goal of going sailing and going racing in that first season. On July 4th in 2015, Marilee launched after the first round of restoration work. We finished on the podium at all 4 events that we participated in that year: Marblehead, Corinthian Classic Regatta, the Nantucket Opera House Cup Regatta, and Museum Yachting at the end of the season. We managed to podium everywhere. It was one of those moments where I think the owner realized what he had. This was a fast boat, and even though we were just learning how to race it, we were still out there extremely competitive and successful. For as much as we did in that first season of refit restoration work, there was quite a bit more to do the second round. We had to continue to deal with planking issues and structural issues. All that work was left for the second season. So again, we had to completely rip the boat apart and break it all the way back down into just framing and planking and get back to work.
We needed to get this boat completely restored to the French Webb level and what the owner wanted in 9 to 10 months.
The team at French Webb just went all out. They did an incredible amount of work in a short amount of time. First season was incredible, but the second season was probably more so, because on top of it, we had to build an entire interior, and the boat had to be perfect.
One of the weak points of these boats as racing boats was where the connection of the wires come down to the hull, the chain plates. And Marilee's chain plates, when they came to us, were just bolted pieces of bronze half-inch plate to the inside of the planking. No structure, not attached to structure, so you're asking the hull skin to support the structure of the rig. So what we did, this was Ed McClave's, brilliance, was we spread out the load on 5 frame bays. So instead of a point load that was 2 inches on a hull skin, we spread it out over 8 feet, and all only on structure, framing, shear clamp, deck beams, and we tried to transfer all that load to the keel and not use the hull skin as transferring that load. One of the great things at MIT is all the beautiful plans of the Herreshoff hardware that you can draw on. So with Ed McClave's engineering, he was able to take some of the Herreshoff shapes and hardware and actually redraw a bunch of stuff for us. So we made a lot of custom hardware on the boat, but we also used a lot that was there.
Because we have these boats in their original condition, it means that you can look at them and decide for yourself. And so there's this element of interpretation that is available to builders here. The experts, the true craftsmen, can come here and look and decide what was incidental on any given day. But by looking at the whole collection, they can see what is fundamentally Herreshoff in nature, which is extraordinary. I can't think of another collection that has this much historical documentation and has this much of a presence.
The way the Herreshoff Manufacturing Company started was Captain Nat had been working at the Corliss Steam Engine Company in Providence. At night, he would moonlight as his brother's chief designer. He did that up until 1878, when he agreed to join JB as a partner in the company. When they first started the company, it was primarily a powerboat company. They didn't go into business to make sailboats at all. They made sailboats, but mostly for themselves and their friends, because when you live on Narragansett Bay and there are no bridges and the roads are bad, the way you get around is by jumping in a sailboat and going sailing somewhere. Nat and JB were both enthusiastic racers. That was their sort of pastime, and they would spend a lot of time sailing together. Yachting as a broad-based sport was just starting to take root. Until that point, it had been a lot of regattas that would be organized by the Queen for massive schooners. So for the first time, smaller boats were starting to actually race against each other. At the same time, people were starting to, the robber barons moved to Newport, and they all wanted boats. They all wanted sailboats to race, and they needed a new one every year, pretty much. So a couple of the Herreshoff Manufacturing Company's early customers became serial customers. They'd order a new boat from them every year. The 11th sailboat that the company built was actually the one that put it on the map from a sailboat perspective, and that was in 1891. They designed and built Gloriana. 12 or 13 years into the life of the company, it was only the 11th sailboat that they'd built. It was raced in 1891 by a gentleman named E.D. Morgan, who had been a regular customer of theirs for other boats, and it won every single race it sailed in. The next year, the New York Yacht Club Syndicate came to them to design the Defender for the 1893 Cup. A member of that syndicate was E.D. Morgan himself, so that's how that sort of came about. They were also doing early assembly line manufacturing at the Herreshoff Manufacturing Company. Many of the one designs that they built here for clubs were built all in a series, all right next to each other, all at exactly the same time. It worked the same way with the New York Yacht Club one designs, the New York 30, the New York 40, the 50, and the New York 70.
When they first came out, they were incredibly powerful in 1916. The New York 50s and the New York 30s before them, and the New York 70s before that, were all-out racing classes crewed by many professional crew at the time.
The New York 40 class was a different concept. These were owners who wanted to be more part of the action, and ultimately class rules would limit the number of professionals on board, which was different from the 50s and 70s especially. This promoted more family and friends to join on the boats for class racing, and it turned out to be a great success since the boats quickly earned the nickname Fighting 40s because of the close racing and great camaraderie amongst the crews.
The rigs on the New York 40s are one of the last editions of a racing gaff rig, especially in Marilee's case in 1926. Back in 1916, they were still racing gaff rigs all over the United States and in Europe. In 1926, when Marilee was built, Ragosa, her sister ship, was actually launched as a Bermudan yawl. Marilee was still rigged as a gaff so that she could compete with the other New York 40s at the time in one design racing. Marilee was one of the last real racing classes, or racing designs, at Herreshoff with that gaff rig. They quickly turned over into Bermudan rigs that were a bit quicker upwind, maybe not as fast off the breeze, but definitely were more easily driven in racing applications.
The second year was the major restoration. It really was the lion's share of the work. We made a new boom, 8-stave construction, hollow, a new gaff, a new topsail yard, and they're just, pieces of sculpture. Not only was the deck shop, but with the new shear that we needed to cut in the boat, the 4 inches of shear that was out, we actually had to replace the deck structure hull connection. And that is called a shear clamp, which is the length of the boat, this longitudinal timber we had to take out and make new. The actual center line of the deck was out too. So every deck beam had to be replaced to its proper camber. Normally, Herreshoff would have, in the original build, the deck would have just been a single thickness laid deck with caulk seams, meaning cotton rolled in and black pitch tooled into the seams. In this day and age, people want water integrity. They don't have the crew that can, constantly upkeep and keep the decks wet all the time like they would in the old shipping days. So we actually designed a deck that was a teak covering on it. And then underneath that was, instead of full thickness teak, which is really heavy, we actually put Port Orford cedar down, which would have been more in keeping with the pine deck that was original. And then we laminated 2 layers of 1/8-inch cedar at 45 degrees. So there's 4 layers of deck, but it's not a plywood deck, it's a solid deck. It has the same weight characteristics as the pine deck, so we're not like overdoing it with, you know, added weight on the boat. But it's structurally much stronger than the original. We made all new knees for the boat, but we added in the high load areas, like the running back stay areas, the chain plate areas, and the midsection of the boat, 5 of these, what I call web frames or belt frames inside. And each one of those frames had a knee. And it's just like, to make all that all kind of flow together in an open interior, which is one of the Herreshoff pieces of this interior, is like you can sit on one side of the boat and you can see all the way to the bow and all the way to the stern inside the boat and all the structure. And these knees they just carry the line throughout this whole thing.
Aside from all the major structural and, you know, racing improvements that we had planned for that second winter of restoration work, the big elephant in the room was the interior. We needed to, you know, fully refit the boat with a brand new interior. And by brand new, we were not going to go back to the original designs of 1926.
This is one of the special times of this project, I think, is the interior. And I say that having worked on many, many boats and their interiors and the traditional kind of yacht interiors that we've all been exposed to. The owner had a vision that was a little different.
We sat down at the offices of Stevens & Waring in Belfast and did a complete 3-dimensional rendering of what he was hoping for this interior.
The NY40 agenda allowed owners to make their own choices down below. The rest of the yachts were built essentially almost as a one design class, the same rigs and similar layout and deck hardware and things like that. That's what enabled them to race together as a class. But the owners had their own choices down below, and as with this restoration, our client made his own choices and established a very interesting direction.
This interior was supposed to have some patina to it, but also be a Herreshoff interior. So the materials we use were going to be period materials. I was able to find, through some connections in a mill in North Carolina, some amazing old growth cypress logs that had been sunk in a river for 140 years.
We don't want to say that it was a modern interior because we actually used a lot of the same design facets, a lot of the same materials of an original Herreshoff interior. We wanted it to look like it came from 1926, but at the same time we wanted to sort of open up the boat and make the space inside of a NY40 more appreciable than it would have been in 1926.
The challenge with designing a more modern take on an interior for the NY40 is the Hurt hull shape and the limited interior volume. The biggest factor of which is her slack bilges, which tends to basically limit the floor space, the cabin sole in the boat, across the beam of the boat. And we worked hard to find the best solutions to use that space. We discovered by essentially moving the furniture of the settee arrangements outboard and up gave us the ability to open up the elbow room to free up traffic flow, and also allowed us to set off the pieces of furniture in a more distinctive fashion.
We were pushing to make all the moldings the Herreshoff style, frame and panel work and trim. But the vision behind this was to actually texture it and give it some age. So not only did we have old wood, but we built beautiful new work with it. And then we went through this laborious process of distressing it to make it look old. It took a leap of faith, and I have to hand it to the owner. He had it. He had the vision. But once we signed on to what it was going to be, it took a leap of faith with the crew to actually come up with the techniques and work with it and build this beautiful bulkhead and then start beating it with chains and texturing it with, taking the grain out with like wire wheels and just, and then oxidizing it and bleaching it and staining it with this hard wax oil stain so it could come up to this insanely beautiful, alive interior.
The idea for the second rig came about almost unexpectedly. We never went into the project with it as one of the goals for her restoration. But when we first visited the Hart Nautical collection at MIT and met Kurt Hasselbeck, he immediately whipped out every single plan that belonged to MARILEE, belonged to the whole process of building her in 1926. Along with that, we uncovered a plan drawn by Herreshoff of MARILEE with a Marconi rig.
And I can remember the big smiles on their face when we pulled out the Marconi sail plan and they realized that that was a whole other option.
Each time that the rig got changed, they had to actually rebuild the bow structure and the stern to accommodate a backstay and a forestay in two different locations. So one of the other design parameters, which was totally creative way of looking at this, is how do you get two boats in one? So the owner asked us to work with the engineers and design a rig that could be interchangeable in a couple days. So we designed a bow structure that was hidden in the deck and hidden in on the stem. This amazing piece of bronze sculpture that was fabricated that went down the bow and on the deck and around the stem. Actually had to go through the stem a little bit. So this was a very hard thing to do. How do you like cut, a slot in a big piece of oak timber and keep it straight and just a half-inch slot? And the creativity of some of our guys, Steve Guerin, who was project foreman at the time, actually came up with this idea to use a chainsaw to cut this slot. So Elijah and John spent a couple days making a jig because you could screw up fast. And they did an amazing job to cut a beautiful, perfectly aligned slot for this piece of hardware to slip into. When you remove the bowsprit, you have this forestay fitting that can support 40,000 pounds load.
In the past, with boats of this vintage, they would have started as gaffs like MARILEE did, and then continued through an evolution and maybe landed with a Bermudan rig or a yawl rig later in their life, just as sailing had changed over time. But to be able to experience all of that in a 3-year period is incredible.
This Marconi rig actually is an elliptical section mast. In sailboat design and spars design, you want to keep things as lightweight as possible because the more weight you have up aloft, the more unstable your boat can be. So we were able to construct them in such a way as they were in the late 1920s, but put a little bit of a kind of modern feel on them. We took beautiful vertical grain Douglas fir and matched all the wood so that all the glue joints would almost look like a piece of grain line, and then sculpted it and shaped it so that this hollow spar would look like one piece. We tried to keep to the aesthetic of the 1920s, which was all bronze hardware, and we were able to build in chases inside the mast to actually bring the halyard lines down, and so they exited just above the deck here. So the main halyard and the jib halyard have custom shiv boxes built into them. All the chain plates, all the connections to the boat and the hull structure are interchangeable between the gaff and the Marconi. So you can just use the same turnbuckles, but all these wires and stuff can be accommodated for either rig.
One of the exciting pieces of finding that Bermudan design was that we found it in the Herreshoff archives, and it was penned by Herreshoff at the manufacturing company. Now that was extremely rare. We talked to Kurt, and he told us that MARILEE was the only one they found in the archives from all the original documentation of a New York 40 with a Bermudan rig. Other New York 40s that came out with Bermudan rigs later in their life may have had them drawn by Nevins or by Stevens, or other yards would have built them for those boats. But to have MARILEE with a Herreshoff penned Bermudan rig gave us that authenticity that we would need when we arrived in the Mediterranean or wanted to race in New England. The boat had pedigree with this rig. The painstaking effort to make MARILEE a stronger, stiffer, and more resilient boat is really paying off with this new rig. Loads are different, but MARILEE can accept all of that. All of the new sails are fitting very well, first try, and the boat is balancing perfectly. But we're not worried about her structure, and we know that she's going to last for a long time to come.
In the 2016 season of racing, we had more expectations for the boat. The crew was more organized. We knew what needed to happen, but at the same time, the boat was almost more difficult to tune than it was that first season. We had upgraded the rigging quite a bit. We had a new rigging package, standing and running, so we had to spend some time tuning the rig. Our first event was at the Camden Classics Cup. We unfortunately didn't have any breeze to race on the first day, but the second day was a great day for racing, and it was a great day for MARILEE. It was a perfect shakedown. It was light air, and we were pretty quick in those conditions. We were second across the line behind a big Spirit of Tradition boat. So at Eggemogan Reach in 2016, in light of our 20% penalty after winning the year before, we still managed to find the podium with a third place finish, which was a terrific result. There were 3 days of racing this year in Nantucket. 2 days of windward leeward racing, which is unique for a boat like MARILEE. MARILEE was designed for short distance racing, out and around Block Island and back type of thing. Windward leeward racing is more for meter style boats and smaller boats. So it was a great 2 days of hard crew work to get this boat up and around a short windward leeward track. Although we didn't perform our best, it was fantastic preparatory work for the big event, which was the Opera House Cup on Sunday. The Opera House Cup was terrific. We sailed very fast, we sailed the boat hard, and the conditions were ideal for MARILEE. There was a lot of off-the-wind work, and she is untouchable in those conditions. We finished second, and on top of it, won the Best Restoration Award, which was incredible. That was icing on the cake at an otherwise terrific event for racing.
In 2016, we arrived in Bristol, Rhode Island for the Herreshoff Classic Yacht Regatta.
We had a really beautiful event with a nod to both MARILEE and Ragosa, the final 2 New York 40s ever built and still existing in racing shape, which was a fantastic time on the dock and up under the tent at the Herreshoff Marine Museum. Our final event was a Museum of Yachting event in Newport, hosted by Iris. We had a fantastic few days of racing. The second day was the most exciting. It was blowing upwards of 20 knots and MARILEE was flying. So we had some exciting racing and finished third overall, which was a nice finish to our season, making the podium at every event. After the event at the awards ceremony, MARILEE was again crowned with the Best Restoration Award, the Tom Benson Award for Best Restoration.
There was a lot of competition this year. Great boats. Just great boats. And MARILEE, with all her work, stood out.
It's the winner for this year's Tiedemann Award, MARILEE, owner Tim.
Stood out enough to win Opera House and to win again, Museum of Yachting. Museum of Yachting one was special because it was an industry-led judging group. It wasn't owners, it wasn't museums. There were no politics to it.
In 2017, we started with a whole new program in the springtime. The boat was in the water far earlier than it ever had been, and we had all sorts of time to prepare. It's something that we were lacking in the years prior. We were making it up as we went in 2015 and 2016. But this past year we had all the time that we needed to prepare the boat, to prepare the crew, to prepare our sails, and to get everyone in sync for another year of racing. The crew really came together. The boat was absolutely the fastest it's ever sailed, and we went undefeated in all of the Panerai events. From Marblehead to Nantucket to Bristol and Newport, we never lost a race and took home the overall Panerai Vintage Grand Classic Award.
Of the 14 New York 40s originally built in 1926 and 1916, there are only 4 remaining. 2 here in the United States, Ragosa and Marilee, and 2 in Europe, Rowdy and Chinook. Rowdy and Chinook are both very active on the Mediterranean circuit, and they're also very successful. Rowdy has had numerous overall Panerai wins, and Chinook has also won Panerai overall awards. So we are very anxious and excited to head to Europe and go take them on.